Well, good morning, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers of this summit for inviting me and for launching an exciting program. I got here yesterday afternoon and got a chance to sit in on the afternoon presentation and also the great poster session. So that was all really great. It's also a pleasure for me to see a number of friends and colleagues that I do run into from time to time. Some of you will have heard some of what I'm going to say before, so the test will be easier for you at the end of the session. And if you need to cheat, you could go to cmcr.ucsd.edu online. Some of these slides are there as well. So I think no introduction to medicinal cannabis can proceed without paying homage to the man who really started the field, and that's Raphael Mechoulam, Israeli scientist who really was the first to characterize tetrahydrocannabinol as the active ingredient in marijuana, the active psychoactive ingredient, that is. And we were very fortunate that Dr. Mechoulam did serve as an external advisor when we set up the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, and he's still an active and lovely man. Now, it will come as no surprise to you that cannabis has been around a long time. I'm not going to go back to 8000 BC, as some speakers have done, because that would take a while. But it is interesting that here is a date-stamped 1913 bottle from Eli Lilly Company that illustrates the properties of cannabis americana. I want to emphasize the Americana part, where that it was native. And, but it's interesting that even at that time, the anecdotal evidence suggested some of the properties that we are beginning to confirm really are true, the antispasmodic, antiemetic, some of the other properties. So why has this become popular in the last couple of decades? Clearly, there were a number of convergent trends. Some of these were political, some of these were scientific, and some of these involved anecdotal evidence that was growing apace. So that's provided on this slide here. But I think the interesting thing is that the anecdotal evidence and some of the political shifts really having to do with public's general perception that cannabis was not as bad as it was cracked up to be. Cracked up to be, that's a bad, sorry. Lecturing on cannabis, there are no number of double, triple, and quadruple entendres that one slips into, so just bear with me. But the, I think, really exciting trends had to do with advances in neurobiology, which started really figuring out what are the ways in which THC particularly affects the brain and the body. And so that led to the discovery of the cannabinoid receptors, so-called CB1 and CB2 receptors. There may be others that will be discovered. And then that led further to the discovery of the endogenous molecules, signaling molecules, that worked with these receptors. And the two that are well characterized are anandamide and 2-AG. Now, this map I always hesitate showing because every month I have to change it. But roughly speaking, we now have 27 states of the Union that permit some reasonable access to medicinal cannabis. And then the green ones are the ones that have legalized marijuana entirely. Missing from there, by the way, it looks like is Guam, and I think there's somebody, Puerto Rico, I guess, as well. I don't know if there's anybody here from Puerto Rico. But the point is that the majority now of the country has at least some access to medicinal cannabis. Now, those of you who are in the field Bear with me if I show you some very primitive cartoons. But basically, this is to remind us that these cannabinoid receptors, be they CB1 or CB2, are widely distributed in the body. CB1 tends to be more concentrated in the nervous system, and I'll show a little bit more on that in a moment. But they are also found in the gut, the liver, ovaries, uterus, all throughout the body, cardiovascular system and so forth. The CB2 receptor tends to be more involved in immune signaling and immune regulation, although it is also found in the brain and central nervous system. Here's my version of the brain. Forgive me for its somewhat primitive nature. But the idea is to really illustrate through the depth of the green coloring where is the concentration, in this case, of CB1 receptors. And I think by looking at that, you can then infer what is going to be the action of agonists such as tetrahydrocannabinol on the brain. So you can see, just to select a few, there's a high concentration in the amygdala. That is an organ, or a nucleus rather, that has a lot to do with fear and anxiety modulation and stress response. You find it in the cerebral cortex, has to do with executive function, higher thinking functions. In the hippocampus, so memory can be affected. And in other areas that control eating and vegetative behaviors. So from this you can see that there are really widespread effects that are possible. Now, we don't need to go through this. I mentioned the two endogenous cannabinoids are anandamide and 2-AG. And they have really kind of an interesting way of acting. For those of you who have studied neuroscience or even lay kind of knowledge of it, know that neurotransmitters act by an electrochemical signal being propagated from one cell to the next cell, right? So it could be dopamine, acetylcholine, whatever. The endocannabinoids act differently. They're really regulator molecules. I call them circuit breakers at times. So in this illustration, let's say we have the propagation of an excitatory signal through glutamate. That goes to the neighboring cell and it will stimulate that cell. But simultaneously, that receiving cell elaborates, in this case, 2-AG, one of the endocannabinoids, which then docks back on the first cell and regulates the further release of that glutamate. So there is this regulatory function that seems important in the endocannabinoid system. And the reason I mention that is that I think in the future, there is going to be a whole class of medications, whether they be derived botanically or synthetically, that take advantage of this regulatory function. That's just to brag a little bit that we have a Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, and I think the serious point here is that that was established over 20 years ago, and I think the University of California and the state of California are to be congratulated for kind of being at the forefront of beginning this kind of work. We now have a number of centers and programs throughout California that are doing wonderful work. UCLA has a center, UC Irvine, Davis, San Francisco. I'll probably insult people by naming all of them, but there is a real growth of interest in this area. But we were pleased to be there kind of early on. And the way it happened was interesting. First of all, California passed, as you know, the first in the country medicinal cannabis law, which was the Compassionate Use Act. And something wonderful happened, at least in my experience, now that we look at how politics is going these days. One of the proponents of the medicinal cannabis law, Senator John Vasconcellos, unfortunately, the senator has passed away, wonderful man. He was very passionate. He really believed in medical marijuana, but at the same time, he came to the university and said, you know, the way to really advance his agenda was to develop the science basis for it, and how can we do that? And so based on that, he authored legislation that established the CMCR, and we ended up conducting some of the first of the modern era studies on medicinal cannabis. But I do want to always give a shout out to Senator Vasconcellos and his colleagues. And currently we have in the legislature also people who are very interested in this topic, not by way of furthering a specific agenda, but really understanding. I love this chart. Those people who think, okay, marijuana is legal in Washington, California, whatever, now we can do all this research. Not. The only legal source of at least plant-derived cannabis for medical research is the federal government through NIDA's program. And they have a farm, as I'm sure you've heard, at the University of Mississippi, which we visited one time. It's a fun place. If you want to do a study, you have to go through a number of steps. And I only illustrate all this, not to make you dizzy, but to show you that the research can be done. It's not true that the feds or some evil people there are blocking research. That is not true. But what is true is it takes time and patience and resources to organize these studies. So in the case of the CMCR, for example, we received an allocation in the 2000s, and we issued a call for proposals. By the way, we'll be issuing a new call for proposals. I'll come back to that. And based on that, we had a review from an external scientific board of our own. We then had to consult with the Research Advisory Panel of California, which is an entity that has to approve controlled substance research in California. And then there are a number of federal steps. In the early days, there had to be approval by the DHHS, Health and Human Services. This actual little three-set box is now gone. But then there still had to be approval from the Food and Drug Administration, the DEA. I always like to tell the story. The DEA review is at two levels. One is at Washington, and then once they are okay with that, then you have to deal with or work with local DEA agents, and they sometimes have interesting perspectives. So for example, we were doing one study on the UC San Diego campus in sort of trailers. You know, UC system is not always the fastest at moving temporary structures into permanent ones. These temporary structures had been there only 20 years, and they were going to eventually get to be buildings. But anyway, it was an outpatient CRC, or clinical research center. So we had set up our testing in that area, installed vacuums to get the smoke out and all that stuff. But when the DEA agent came, he said, well, where are you going to store the marijuana? I said, well, it's going to be in this safe right here. He said, well, but you can't do that. The entire trailer isn't bolted to the, to the pad, the concrete pad. What if somebody moved the entire trailer? And so on and so forth. So there are interesting considerations that you have to go through. And it took at that time, and I think it's probably still true, from the time you actually submit a proposal to actually getting product that you can administer to a participant in a human trial, takes about a year. Maybe it's shortening a little bit. But just so you know. Our original studies were in a number of places. I'm just going to show you one example, which is a UC San Francisco study by Dr. Donald Abrams. And what he was interested in is the question of neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain is a kind of chronic, disabling, very uncomfortable sensation. It involves sometimes burning, tingling in the feet and hands, hypersensitivity to light touch, and various symptoms of that nature. And these are not the kinds of pain that are actually well treated with opioids, for example. Opioids are terrific if you have a gunshot wound or if you're recovering from surgery where they've cut you open and sewed you up and everything hurts. But for neuropathic pain, they do work, but they have to be given chronically. The doses tend to have to get escalated and so forth. There are other treatments for neuropathic pain. They include certain kinds of antidepressant drugs, anti-epileptic drugs, and so forth. But there was certainly preliminary evidence, both anecdotally and from animal research, that this kind of pain might respond to cannabis, and particularly THC-containing products. So that was the basis of Donald Abrams' study. So people with HIV/AIDS tend to suffer from this kind of pain. So he identified 50 participants and first of all screened them on an outpatient basis, evaluated them. Then they were admitted to an inpatient unit, and then they were randomized to either receiving marijuana, which was smoked with 4% THC, or placebo marijuana, like decaf coffee. I guess it's smelled about the same, but didn't have the punch. So what happened was, as you can see, the red line, which is the active treatment, showed a significant improvement in neuropathic pain over the 1-week trial that the people were in the hospital, and that there was some persistence of that effect even when the trial ended. Important also, by the way, is the yellow line also went down. That's the placebo line. So you have all heard about placebo effects. It's really very important for trials to be cognizant of that. The placebo effect, by the way, is real. These are people who feel better. We don't know the mechanisms, but it's not to be written off as, oh, it's nonsense. So in the first phase of our being, then, we conducted 7 different small-scale clinical trials. Most of them concentrated on either neuropathic pain or other kinds of chronic pain syndromes, and one involved severe muscle spasticity and multiple sclerosis. And as you can see, I don't know if you can, those of you closer to the front maybe can read it. You'll see the concentrations of THC that were involved. In some studies, there were several arms, or people sequentially went through different dosage regimens. Some were crossover studies, some were parallel group designs. And you can see that the highest concentration of THC was about 8%, and the lowest was somewhere around 1.3%. I can't see this slide at this angle very well, but I think it's in here. So that's the range of concentrations of THC. We'll come back to that because, as we know, on the street, these would be considered very wimpy concentrations, shall we say, at this point. So one way to look at the possibility of effectiveness is to compute something called a number needed to treat. There are other metrics. But basically, I don't even know if you need to look at the formula, but basically what it is that the lower the number, the more effective the agent is. So in this, whoops, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. In this particular display, what you can see is that the tricyclic antidepressants, which are old-line antidepressants like tofranil, Elavil, also known as amitriptyline, imipramine, actually are very good at treating this kind of pain. And interestingly, they do so at a dosage level that is not typically the antidepressant level, so it's at a lower dosage level. We see the same effect for cannabis, by the way. Cannabis then is about the same as gabapentin, which is another commonly used drug in these kinds of conditions, and seems to be outperforming some of the other drugs that are sometimes used. So the main point here is that, at least in the short term, THC-containing cannabis was about as good as many drugs that are used, and so represents another quiver, if you will, in our armamentarium to treat these conditions. So a summary of our studies are there. I've shown you the basic results. In terms of side effects, the commonest were rapid heart rate. Some people felt high, as you would expect. Some felt tired. A lot of them got red eyes. Neurocognitive testing, that is testing of memory, attention, and so forth, revealed, as you would predict, some small decrements while the people were receiving the medications, but those reversed pretty quickly. If you would think of an average drop, it would be about half a standard deviation reduction in a global measure of cognitive function that then improved. Whether that's any better or worse than other drugs like benzodiazepines, we don't know, because there isn't actually, if you believe it, a lot of data out there on that. And other side effects were dizziness and sedation and so forth, but none of them required treatment discontinuation. So basically, our data showed that yes, there's a signal here, particularly for neuropathic pain, probably for severe muscle spasms in MS, that the treatment was tolerable, didn't have a lot of bad side effects. There were some, so that's was our conclusions. And I think that our conclusions then nested very nicely into this massive report that was produced by the National Academies in 2017. I don't know, is there anybody here? I know Donald Abrams was on that report, Piamelli. I don't know if any of these folks are here, but anyway, it was a massive review of the literature. By the way, the report is available not only on the National Academy site, but if you go to cmcr.ucsd.edu, we have it posted there if you want to study it. But in summary, oh, stop it. In summary, what they found was very good evidence, basically, for the efficacy of cannabinoids in the treatment of chronic pain, spasticity in MS, which I've talked about based on our studies as well, control of nausea, which we've known all along because Marinol, dronabinol, is an approved drug for the management of nausea. Interestingly, they found moderate evidence for cannabinoid efficacy in improving sleep, particularly in those who may have pain. Now, we haven't personally researched that, but I know in talking with a lot of people my age, one of the things that attracts them to the whole cannabis story is the possibility that cannabidiol may be helpful in helping them sleep, because a lot of old people have trouble sleeping, and some of that trouble sleeping is related to various aches and pains. So I think this is a very promising area of research. They found limited evidence for cannabinoid efficacy in the treatment of anxiety disorders, though I think that is going to change in the future. I think there'll be more promising results there. And in promoting appetite and weight gain, I'm not sure why they put that as limited evidence, because any of you who has had the munchies will know that you eat more, and you eat more of the wrong stuff typically. So, and there is some evidence seriously that in patients with cachexia, AIDS-related weight loss, which fortunately we don't see so much anymore with good HIV treatments, that marijuana was helpful. And that they said insufficient evidence for some other things. Now, the one thing that does need to be updated is this thing about epilepsy, because as you know, and I'll come to in a moment, there is a lot of interest in cannabidiol, particularly as an anti-epileptic. So I think there's no question now that cannabis is safe and effective for, at least in the short term, because we haven't done the long-term studies, with certain conditions. However, there are problems. For example, if your delivery system is a joint, there are issues with safety of a combustible substance in a hospital, for example, secondhand smoke, all of these other kinds of things. So it's clear that although that may be a method that people could use in their home safely, that it's not going to be a typical method of administering these medications, and so we have to look at other possibilities. The other thing that this then brings us to is that there are real differences in the pharmacokinetics of THC, CBD, and these other cannabinoids depending on mode of administration. From the standpoint of efficiency, inhaling the stuff is the best because the blood levels rise quickly, and then THC, in this case, is cleared. This is the left-hand panel here, this. THC is cleared from plasma fairly quickly. Now, it does get redistributed to all the tissues, including the brain. So the effects may continue way beyond when you can see measurable blood levels because the THC is exerting its effects, particularly in tissues that have a lot of fat. Unfortunately, our brains have a lot of fat. Or maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I don't know. That joke didn't go very well. All right. So in contrast, when cannabis is consumed by mouth, there are a number of steps that have to occur. It has to go through your stomach, to your small intestine. Part of it gets degraded and is no longer active. Your internal bacteria, they like the marijuana. They use it up too. I don't know what the effect on them is, but they take their share. Then it has to be absorbed, and next the liver takes a chunk of it because everything that you take into your gut tends to first pass through the liver, which is kind of like a sanitation plant, tries to get rid of stuff it doesn't think you should have or change things around. So by the time it gets to your bloodstream, the concentration of THC may be fairly low. That's called first pass metabolism. And so the time course is also much extended, as those, if you've talked to people who've either smoked versus eaten, you know that sometimes people don't feel an effect for a couple of hours. And then the effect goes on, and they may or may not like that. The other thing that happens is that the liver can also convert THC into another active ingredient, this hydroxy or carboxy THC, excuse me, the hydroxy THC. And that is actually quite a potent psychoactive drug in its own right.